pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Come with me to the book of Exodus. If you've been following along in the study guide, you know that last week I had you reading a little bit further ahead, catching up with some of the how to read the Bible in a year. But today we go backwards into the second half of the book of Exodus. And I want to begin this morning with a quote from who else but Dallas Willard. I almost get one quote a week in from Dallas Willard. But this one you're going to have to work with. This one you're going to have to struggle with a little bit. So let's try it. I might read it 2 times. Willard said this: I am thoroughly convinced that God will let everyone into heaven who, in his consideration, can stand it. Ooh. I see your face, Jim. You're wrestling with it. I've wrestled with this one too. Let me say it again so you all hear it. I am thoroughly convinced, Willard says, that God will let everyone into heaven who, in his considered opinion, can stand it. I give you that quote because I think this text that we're in today will help us to understand this a little bit, understand what it means to come into God's presence fully. So come with me, as I said, into the second half of Exodus. We're going to start in chapter 19 in a minute. But just to catch us all up, remember we're in the story. I think this is week 5 at this point. We've looked at Genesis. We've looked at creation, where God says, I have no rivals and everything I've created is good. He looked at those that went in rebellious ways, went the way of Cain. Those in the time of Noah, or in the Tower of Babel, or in Sodom and Gomorrah. But he also began to craft this story through his people and through the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who he later renamed Israel. He crafts his story in and through the people of Israel. Deb preached a couple of weeks ago, and we began the second book. We began to come into Exodus, where we discovered that God's people had been in slavery for 400 years. But God says, I hear you. I see you. And I see all the hardships you're in, and so I'm going to come and make my presence known to you. And he reveals himself to Moses at the burning bush and tells Moses a new name that he wants to be known by: Yahweh, Jehovah, or I am. And that name, we've discovered in past times, means a God who sets us free, who leads us to life for the sake of the world. So come with me to Exodus 19, and we begin this second half in what's known as the Sinai tradition. This conversation, literally, that goes between Moses and God for like the second half of the book of Exodus. Now, there's some interludes that we'll pay attention to, but I do want to just begin this conversation. We're going to mostly look at chapter 32 and 33 today, but you can't understand the conversation unless you start in chapter 19. So listen to verses 3 to 6, and I want you to think, where have I heard this before? Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you're to say to the descendants of Jacob, what you're to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully, keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you're to speak to the Israelites. Where have you heard that before? Or something very, very similar to that? It's 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. And this is where Peter got it. Because all through the story, God is creating a people who will know his presence, live in his power for his purpose. And that's what Exodus is about. That's what this whole conversation between Moses and God is all about, that God's purposes would be fulfilled. Now we know that in chapter 20, God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. And oh, have we misunderstood all that they are for? They're not a bunch of rules we have to follow. What are they? They're a description of who God is. And if we as his people learn to live in accordance with those guidelines, we bear witness to who he is in a world that is without him. Well, in 21 through 31, we see all kinds of other guidelines and rules that God gives. How are you supposed to deal with idols and altars and personal injuries, and how do you set up the tabernacle and all those things. And we're not going to spend time on that today, but come with me to chapter 32. And you know chapter 32. You've heard it before. Chapter 32 starts off in this way. It's just a very, very, very bad day. We get to chapter 32, and it's the whole story of the golden calf. It's a story in which we see God's people behaving in an opposite manner to everything that God's just told them. Here's who I am, so live this way. And they live the other way. They've created a golden calf instead of a golden temple. They've tried to create something that God's already provided. What's that? His presence. They are demonstrating that they're going to live in their own agency instead of God's agency. And worst of all, they've tried to box God up. God comes in this passage and begins to speak to Moses, who's up on the mountainside getting the 10 Commandments. And God speaks, and it's mind-bending. I bet you none of you have ever thought of God in this way. Hear what God says in verses 7 down to 10, chapter 32. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt." Did you catch that? Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They've bowed down to it, sacrificed to it, and have said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." I've seen these people, the Lord said to Moses. They're a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and I may destroy them. Then I'll make you into a great nation. It's hard to believe, but there's so many things he says here. Like, notice in verse 7, he renounces his people. What do you think, one of us? Tara's going to go look. Nope. He renounces his people. Your people, he says to Moses, your people that you brought up out of Egypt. Now come on. Go back to chapter 20, verse 2. Right in the 10 Commandments, he says, you are my people who I brought out of Egypt, so therefore live in a certain way. And now what he's done is he's totally renounced them. It's kind of like when our kids were growing up and they were misbehaved. And I said to Shelley all the time, your kids, you deal with them. Right? This is what God is saying to Moses. They're not mine, they're yours. He's renounced his people. Then in verse 8 and 9, he names their sin. They're worshiping other gods. That's what burnt offerings were all about. And not only are they worshiping them, they're giving credit to a golden calf for all that God's done. 2 grave sins. So he says to Moses, leave me alone. I'm going to act. I'm going to destroy them and start all over with you. Not generally the picture we have of God, is it? Not generally how we sing about him. But Moses responds very quickly in verses 11 to 13. Listen to what he says. But Moses sought the favor of the Lord, his God. Lord, he said, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand. Why should the Egyptians say it's with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains, to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger. Relent. Do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. I'll give your descendants all the land I promised them. It will be their inheritance forever. Don't destroy them, Lord. That's what Moses says. They're your people, your name, not mine. Don't punt them onto me. They're yours. So don't destroy them. Don't destroy them because your reputation will be ruined. The Egyptians will laugh at you. Don't destroy them because, do you remember the promises you made to Abraham, Isaac, and notice how he says Israel there instead of Jacob? It's all again about your people and your power. And he says your purpose. The very words he uses here in response to God in verses 11 through 13 mirror the words that are used in Exodus 19, 3-6. What Moses is on about here is ultimately, God, your purpose will be thwarted. So you're going to send the people into the land? Yeah, but there's a reason you did it, so that they would be a blessing to all the nations. And your purposes will be thwarted if you cut things short right now. So pause for a second. Two things for us. Do we ever talk about God getting angry at sin? Sometimes I think we're guilty of making God into who we want him to be rather than who he actually is. Friends, this text says God's angry. He's angry with sin. And there isn't one of us in the room that doesn't, me included, me front of the line, doesn't need to hear the following line. When we sin, we make him angry. And way too often, we just belittle it. Oh, it's okay, we're forgiven. Oh, it's okay, he's full of mercy. Somehow we shrink the consequences and the ramifications of our sin like it just doesn't matter. It does. But flip the coin over. What does Moses do in the midst of this? Moses is a Jesus figure in the midst of this. Why? Because he comes before the Father and he intercedes. And he invites us to do the same. We need to become intercessors. For whom? Well, here's an example. If you've been over to Robson Park, our Robson Park campus recently, you will know that which I'm talking about. I am so frustrated with our neighbors next door to the east. Joanne Yeager drives in the driveway today and rips out the bottom of her car because they've torn up the driveway. They've left us without parking spots. They've done it without asking us. And everything in me is frustrated, angry, upset. And what do I want to do? I'm a human being. I want to get them back. Deb was supposed to preach today, but I got to do it. And I think it might have been because God wanted me to actually pay attention to this point right here. Because I can't read this text and still be angry with our neighbors without actually realizing he sent me into the neighborhood to actually become an intercessor for them. I want to destroy them. Moses comes and says, oh God, don't destroy them. God is angered by our sin, but he calls us to be intercessors. Look at verse 14. Then the Lord relented, did not bring on his people the disaster that he had threatened. Well, the conversation stops for a few minutes, a few verses. Moses goes down, finds an absolute chaotic scene. Mayhem abounds. His temper boils over. He takes the calf, he burns it, turns it into powder, throws it into the water, makes the people drink it. God didn't tell him to do that. He did it on his own. Comes to his brother Aaron. Aaron, what in the world? I left you in charge. What have you been doing? And of course, Aaron comes back with perhaps the worst excuse, worst rationalization in the history of humanity. I don't know what happened. I just took the gold, threw it in the fire, and look, a calf popped out. I mean, come on. Moses begins to speak to the people and says, sin has consequences. And then he carries on and says, this is what the Lord has said, and all kinds of people are wiped out. But Moses says to the people, I'm going to go back and I'm going to continue my conversation with the Lord, and I will plead for your forgiveness. So come with me to chapter 32, verse 31, and we see Moses back up to the top of the mountain and continuing to talk. He says this. So Moses went back to the Lord and said, oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They've made themselves gods of gold. But now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. Moses goes back up to the top. He's not done a great job leading, and he's taken the tablets that God created and broken them. So now he comes into God's presence and he says, yeah, those people, they've really blown it, haven't they? They've done obvious sins. Everybody can see it. But he says, would you forgive them? He doesn't need to ask the Lord not to destroy anymore. God's already answered that prayer. He's already granted that. I won't destroy. But now Moses says, well, can I go further? Would you forgive them? And in order to sort of leverage God, he pledges solidarity with Israel and says, if you won't forgive them, then just cut me out of the story altogether. As if somehow God's going to be blackmailed. God responds in verse 33. The Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin. Sorry, what's God saying to Moses? Moses has asked that God would forgive, and God basically says, no. Those that have sinned, I will blot them out of my book because they deserve to be punished. Gosh, we don't talk about God a whole lot like that, do we? Now, Moses, go and do your job. Lead these people. Lead these people to the place that I told you to lead them to, and an angel will go before you. Not me, but an angel. Do you know what an understudy is? I remember being in the West End of London and going to a play. So excited because there was a famous person who was the lead of this play. And to get there into the theater, and the announcement goes, the part of so-and-so will be played tonight by such and such. In other words, the famous person that I'd come to see was taking a night off, and the understudy was going to be there. You know what disappointment that is? It doesn't compare to what disappointment Moses must have felt. God says, I'm not forgiving them. Go do your job, and I'm not going. Instead, an angel will go before you. Look at verse 35. And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. Pause. Friends, we got to know this about God. There are consequences to sin. He's angered by our sin, and there are consequences. We cannot put him in a box and say, well, his mercy is great. And us, Oh, we learn so much from Moses. Not only does he intercede for people, now he identifies with them and speaks on behalf of the whole. Forgive them. We need both of those. Come with me to chapter 33. We get to the third part, final part of the conversation that we're going to look at today. Now God speaks. Hey, I want you to go do your job. Take these people into the promised land. He's punished people. He's still angry. And he says in verse 1, Then the Lord said to Moses, Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt. Go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I'll give it to your descendants. I'll send an angel before you, drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you because you're a stiff-necked people. I might destroy you on the way. His answer is amazing. Like he's answering everything Moses has asked. You remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Yep. Okay, I'll do it because I promised. Got it. Yep. But in verse 1, he says, Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt. He's still upset. He's still saying that they're your people, Moses, not my people. Go. Take them to the place I promised, and I'll give you safe passage, and I'll give you security in a land that has more abundance than all you could imagine. But I'm not going to go. I preached this about 15 years ago. There's a verse coming up I want to tell you about in a few minutes that just absolutely was my favorite in all of the Old Testament. But this time as I prepared, I found another verse here, verse 4, that is absolutely stunning. Can we read this together? When the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn. What distressing words? God has just promised them safe passage to a land of abundance. Everything that he talked to them about, I'm going to get you there. It's going to be a land of abundance. What are you worried about? When the Israelites heard this, they mourned. Why? Because they knew they needed his presence. Why was this so important to me? I wonder if we in the West have settled for safety and security instead of longing for his presence. I wonder if the church in the West has settled for, a land of milk and honey, an abundance, where everything goes according to plan, where we're comfortable, where we have all that we want. We've stopped longing for his presence. So many times I get to go to other churches when I'm traveling and teaching, and I listen to prayers. Organizations that I'm part of, I listen to prayers. You know what 99.999% of prayers are about? Me. Us. Lord, make my life easier. Make it better. Make it so that this works out well. Make it so that this person's better. Make it so that... How many of our prayers are actually about the purposes of God, no matter what the circumstances? See, Moses knew all the way through this conversation with God. Moses knew that the most important thing was not getting there safely, was not having all the riches of the land, but it was that God's presence would be with them. For without God's presence, there was no power and there was no fulfilling of his purposes. Look at verses 12 to 13. Moses responds to God's comment. Moses said to the Lord, "You've been telling me, lead these people." He's heard that several times. "But you've not let me know whom you will send with me." In other words, you're sending an angel and I'm going to keep poking at you. "You've said, I know you by name and you've found favor with me. If you're pleased with me, Teach me your ways so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. God responds. Verse 14, my presence will go with you and will give you rest. You think it's done, right? Moses has accomplished what he was seeking after. No, not. Here's why. The you, singular. God says to Moses, I'm going to go with you. Not them, you. And I'm going to give you rest because you found favor with me. And Moses has to come back again in verse 15. Then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, don't send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me or with your people unless you go with us? Not your angel. What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? Moses says your presence has to go with us. If it doesn't, what's the point? Yeah, you provide safe passage. Yeah, you give us all the abundance that the land can supply, but big deal. What's the difference? We're no different than anybody else. The only thing that distinguishes God's people is God's presence. How will anyone know? By the way, the word that Moses uses here when he's talking about distinguishing us from all the other people is the same word that he uses in chapter 19, verse 6, when he's talking about God's purposes. The whole passage is about fulfilling God's purpose. God replies. The Lord said to Moses, verse 17, I'll do the very thing you've asked, because I'm pleased with you. And I know you by name. One person interceding, one person asking forgiveness, one person begging God to come with. And God says yes to the whole people. Verse 18 is a bit funny. Moses says, now show me your glory. In other words, he says, could you put that in writing? I've had to debate this with you for so long. Could you please just put that in writing? Show it to me. And that whole God passing in front of Moses is another story for another day. Friends, intimacy with God is important, and it's in the text. But it's not the point. The point is that we join with God on mission, accomplishing his purposes. God's people need God's presence in order to experience God's power so that they might fulfill God's purpose. God is angered by sin. It destroys, separates relationship. God does not always forgive us just because he said he'll forgive. No, it's not automatic. It needs us turning and coming to him. God's grace, we always get that wrong. God's grace is not about his forgiveness, and his mercy and grace are different things. God's grace is his power at work in us. His presence is not cheap. We need to learn to intercede for the world around us. We need to recognize our sin and repent, not just ours individually, but ours corporately. And then together we seek his presence. Not so that our lives are better, but so we have his power and fulfill his purposes. Pray with me as we come to the table where we will experience his presence before we sing our last song or two.